Morocco was once home to hundreds of thousands of Jews, the largest Jewish community in the Arab world. Despite occasional pogroms and persecution, Moroccan Jews mostly thrived. Over the centuries, they built a rich culture and often rose to positions of great influence. And then, France fell to the Nazis, and a Nazi puppet government took over all of France's colonies, including Morocco. But the country's Sultan wasn't having it. He defied the new authorities at every turn, opposing their anti-Jewish decrees. When they asked for a list of Moroccan Jews, he famously informed them that there were no Jews in his country, just Moroccans. Despite the Nazi officers in their streets, Morocco's Jews managed to escape Hitler's clutches, continuing to thrive even during World War II. But just a few decades later, the bustling streets of Morocco's Jewish neighborhoods were silent. Synagogues shut down, and the community that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands dwindled to a fraction of its former size. Today, just a handful of Jews remain in the country. So if Morocco had once been so welcoming, why did so many Jews leave? No one is sure when exactly Jews arrived in Morocco, but we do know that for centuries, they lived side by side with North Africa's indigenous peoples, the Amazigh, some of whom are believed to have converted to Judaism. But everything changed with the rise of Islam. Suddenly, Morocco's Jews had a new status as dhimmi, monotheist non-Muslims under the protection of the state. If Muslims were at the top of the social hierarchy and non-believers at the bottom, dhimmi were somewhere in the middle. As long as they paid a protection tax and they understood that they were not equal to Muslims, they were allowed to live and worship more or less freely. That was the concept anyway. But like all systems, enforcement depended on whoever was in charge. Some leaders had no interest in persecuting anyone, and it was under these highly tolerant rulers that Jewish culture in Morocco flourished, producing some of Judaism's most influential scholars, mystics, and poets. But some leaders were, shall we say, not as tolerant. When the Almohads took over, they gave their Jewish subjects a choice: Islam or the grave. Those who refused to convert were slaughtered in the hundreds of thousands, their community leaders burned alive. But even conversion was no guarantee of social equality. New converts were viewed with suspicion and scorn, forced to wear distinctive clothing that made them an obvious and visible target. For centuries, Jewish history in North Africa followed a predictable cycle. Decades of tolerance punctuated by persecution. Repression followed by renewal. So when the Spanish monarchy evicted all Jews from the country in 1492, thousands of Jewish refugees fled to nearby North Africa, where they received a mixed reception. The Muslims of Tuat rolled out the welcome carpet by murdering their city's entire Jewish population. But most refugees found a home in the Jewish quarters of Fez, Marrakesh, Chefchaouen, or Tetuan, which began to adopt more and more Spanish Jewish influences. Despite the initial friction between the newcomers and the longtime residents, the Jewish community didn't have the luxury of infighting when the mobs came to the mellah, the North African equivalent of the European ghetto. The first mellah was built near the royal court, both to protect the Jews of Fez and to keep the Sultan's Jewish advisors close by if he needed them. But its high walls were a reminder that even highly valued court Jews could never fully integrate into a society that saw them as less than. As the centuries passed and the region grew more volatile, the mellah grew increasingly dangerous. The relationship between political instability and anti-Jewish persecution is so well established you can chart it on a graph, and the Morocco of the 1800s was particularly unstable. But even as pogroms grew more frequent and new mellahs sprang up across the country, Morocco's Jews kept the faith alive. They studied Torah, they delved into Jewish mysticism, they celebrated holidays and weddings and bar mitzvahs, and they kept the uniquely North African Jewish traditions whose origins no one seemed to remember, like the post-Passover Mimuna party, which celebrates all things dough and carbohydrates. By the early 20th century, many Moroccan Jews began to hope that the dark times were behind them. In 1911, the country became a French protectorate, and Moroccan Jews found themselves with a new slippery status. Neither dhimmis nor citizens, but something in between. Still, they immediately pledged their loyalty to their new colonial overlords. The French had built the country's first modern Jewish schools, not to mention railways, hospitals, and roads. So what if they were racist and often anti-Semitic? Who wasn't? At least they weren't orchestrating pogroms. This is what it means to be perpetually other, at the mercy of whoever is in charge. Basic tolerance feels like equality. A lack of persecution feels like freedom. Until France fell to the Third Reich, the the Jews of Morocco counted themselves lucky. After the Nazis took France, they set up a puppet regime in its colonies. Suddenly, the Jews of Morocco no longer had a say in where they could live, or work, or go to school. Jews who had finally broken out of the mellahs were shoved right back into ghettos, and thousands of Algerian, Moroccan, Tunisian, and Libyan Jews were herded into forced labor camps, where starvation, disease, and abuse ran rampant, and hundreds perished. All the while, Sultan Mohammed V resisted in every way he knew how. He brought rabbis and other prominent Jewish figures to his annual celebration of his sultanate. He refused to meet with Nazi officials who showed up in his country. And until the authorities forced his hand, he resisted passing any anti-Jewish legislation. To this day, Moroccan Jews remember Mohammed V with gratitude, affection, and pride. And what happened next didn't change that, because the Sultan's tolerance had its limits, and it stopped at political Zionism, the movement to establish a self-determining Jewish state in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The land of Israel is central to Jewish practice and identity, and North African Jews had always nurtured a deep and profound love of Zion. So to this devout and deeply spiritual community, the political Zionism that came to North Africa in the 1900s was simply a continuation of their long-held belief that the Jewish people belonged in the land of Israel. Though individual North Africans, many of them from Morocco, had made the pilgrimage to the Holy Land for thousands of years, a mass movement emerged in the 1860s, before political Zionism, as thousands of North African Jews began flocking to Ottoman Palestine, hoping to build a better life in the soil of their ancestral homeland. So when agents from the Jewish Agency began showing up in Morocco, talking about the Zionist dream, Moroccan Jews listened eagerly. They raised money and prayed daily for the Zionist pioneers in Palestine. They dreamed of visiting a future Jewish state, of being buried in the soil of the Holy Land. Still, until the 1940s, very few planned to leave Morocco and start all over from scratch, particularly in Palestine, where hunger and poverty were rampant. But everything changed after World War II. The slaughter of 1 in 3 of the world's Jews reinforced that no one was coming to save them, that even the most tolerant home had its limits, and Jewish people around the globe realized that if they wanted a future as a free and self-determining people, they had to build it themselves. And the Jewish Agency representatives on the ground in Morocco were offering their help to get there. And maybe Sultan Mohammed V would have been sympathetic to such an endeavor if the Jewish homeland were anywhere else. But he was a pan-Arabist, meaning that he saw the entire Arab world as one nation, and all Arabs as one people. And since the Jewish people sought to build their national home in Palestine, where Arabs already lived, the Sultan couldn't just overlook that insult to all Arabs. Plus, after centuries of seeing Jews as dhimmi, protected but never quite equal, the Arab and Muslim world had a very hard time with the concept of Jewish self-determination. Many Muslims believe that Judaism is merely a religion, not a peoplehood, which means that individual Jews could be part of any nation that accepted them, like Morocco, but had no right to a national homeland of their own, especially not on land that had already been conquered by Islam. So when the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, Sultan Mohammed V announced to the country that all Arabs were honor-bound to fight Zionism. And though he reassured his audience that Moroccan Jews had nothing to do with Palestine or Zionism, the extremists in the crowd begged to differ. As one nationalist leader wrote, there would be no sympathy for the, quote, Zionist poison spreading through Morocco. The boycotts and pogroms began shortly after. Not everyone supported the pogroms, of course. Some Moroccan Muslims criticized the mob who had stormed Jewish neighborhoods or set Jewish shops on fire. But when a local governor visited the Jewish families who had been attacked, extremists turned on him too, stabbing him repeatedly in his mosque. Even sympathetic authorities blamed the Jews for the pogrom. If they hadn't been so Zionist, this never would have happened. Quietly, more and more Jewish families made plans to emigrate. It was dangerous, even illegal, to leave for Israel. So well-to-do families relied on personal connections or bribes. Poor families took a more dangerous route, either with the help of a Zionist underground or professional smugglers. Despite the risks of the journey and the terrible living conditions in the newborn Jewish state, roughly 10% of the community had emigrated to Israel by 1951. The rest were not far behind. After more than 40 years as a French protectorate, Morocco finally achieved independence in 1956. For the first time, Moroccan Jews were actually citizens. Not dhimmis, not colonial subjects. Citizens with full equality under the law. Many Jews joined the nationalist movement, excited about the prospect of a new and free Morocco. Some 2,000 Moroccan Jews had even returned from Israel, frustrated with the terrible conditions and worse treatment they endured, and they made a convincing argument for staying put. But as anti-Jewish persecution grew, those arguments began to evaporate. The Nationalist Party pressed Sultan Muhammad V to ban all Zionist organizations. Under pressure from the Arab League, he took the legislation a step further, banning Jews from traveling to Israel for any reason. If they had gone to Israel, they were not welcome to return. And to make sure Moroccan Jews really got the message, the authorities stopped issuing them passports, just in case. The more strongly the authorities came out against Zionism, the more determined the Jews of Morocco were to leave. Somehow, denunciations of Zionism always seemed to lead to punishment. Jewish communities lived in fear of their daughters being abducted and forcibly converted. Police harassed Jews for crimes like taking the bus and driving a car. Jews were arrested, beaten up, and detained on pretexts as thin as wearing blue and white. The increasingly harsh mistreatment demonstrated that Jews would only be tolerated if they amputated a central node of their identity, their ancient relationship to the land of Israel, and their solidarity with their brothers and sisters there. So more and more Jewish Moroccans began turning to the Mossad agents who had been on the ground since 1954. It was the Mossad that came up with the plan to send Jewish children to Israel without their parents by pretending they were en route to a summer camp in Switzerland. It was the Mossad that operated the ships that quietly transported Jews to Gibraltar. And it was the Mossad that was finally able to negotiate the mass exodus of Jews from Morocco, legally, but only after a terrible tragedy. The Egoz was an old World War II era ship, repurposed by the Mossad to transport Moroccan Jews to Gibraltar. By January of 1961, it had ferried more than 300 Jews to safety, but on its 12th trip across the strait, the Egoz hit rough weather. It took less than 5 minutes for the old ship to sink, barely 10 miles from the Moroccan coast. Of the 40-odd people on board, only 3 survived. The downing of the Egoz was a terrible tragedy, but for the state of Israel, which was anxious to bring North African Jews home, it was also an opportunity. Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir pointed out loudly, publicly, and humiliatingly that if Jews had been allowed to leave Morocco legally, they would never have boarded a rickety old ship, stuffed beyond its capacity. As far as she was concerned, this was the fault of the Moroccan authorities, who had denied Moroccan Jews their freedom of movement. When the Americans and Europeans started making noises about the growing mistreatment of Moroccan Jews, Morocco's new king realized he had a choice to make. Shortly after the Egoz affair, King Mohammed V suffered cardiac arrest, leaving his eldest son to rule in his stead. And though Hassan II was no Zionist and had no plans to recognize Israel, he was very wary of the growing discontent of Morocco's 200,000 Jews. Even die-hard Moroccan Jewish nationalists who had once championed anti-Zionism were now calling for a mass migration to Israel. The dream of an egalitarian Morocco had failed, suffocated by a population that punished Jews for refusing to sever a key part of their Jewish identity. So Hassan II struck a secret deal with 2 Jewish organizations, with the backing of the Mossad and the Israeli government. But Hassan could not be seen dealing with Israel. He needed to keep up appearances. Under the terms of the agreement, Moroccan Jews would be allowed to emigrate as individuals, as long as they didn't go to Israel. But everyone knew that that quick stopover in France or Italy was just that, a pit stop before the final destination. To sweeten the deal, these organizations offered a financial incentive. Moroccan Jews were skilled and productive, and the departure of tens of thousands of workers would disrupt the Moroccan economy. Would the king be interested in financial compensation for the hit to his economy? The king, it turned out, was interested. Millions of dollars later, Morocco's Jewish community was effectively hollowed out. Unlike Jews from other Arab countries, Morocco's Jews weren't stripped of assets or property or citizenship, but they understood that once they left, they would not be welcomed back. It was the quietest, least dramatic mass migration in Jewish history. And yet, it holds a tinge of bitterness. Life in Israel was difficult. Wealthy, urban Moroccan Jews who spoke 5 languages suddenly found themselves in hastily constructed tenements, visited by well-meaning but condescending authorities who treated them like poor illiterates. The Zionist dream was beautiful, but the Zionist reality was tough. Poverty, instability, racial discrimination, and of course, the constant skirmishes with every surrounding country. But with time, most of these problems eased. Today, roughly 10 to 15% of Israelis claim Moroccan descent, and Moroccan influence is everywhere. From the pictures of legendary rabbis that adorn market stalls, to the widespread Mimuna celebrations, to the liturgy that entered Israeli synagogues, to the foods and spices that have become iconic and beloved. Tens of thousands of Israelis flock to Morocco each year, eager to see the homes where their grandparents had once lived and to meet the people that their ancestors had lived among for thousands of years. So maybe Moroccan Jews didn't leave Morocco behind entirely. Maybe they carry it with them wherever they go, tucked into their stories and songs, in their customs and memories, a cherished, if bittersweet, legacy of millennia.